Our next speaker is Associate Professor David Pattison, and David Pattison underwent dual training in nuclear medicine and endocrinology in Victoria and worked at the PRRT service for 4 years. In 2016 he moved to Queensland, where he is the Deputy Director of the Department of Nuclear Medicine at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. He has a clinical and research interest in the imaging and radionuclide therapy of endocrine cancers, and tonight we'll be providing an update on PRRT.
So I'll be talking about theranostics, or PRRT, which is a kind of treatment for neuroendocrine tumours. And so, when we talk about theranostics, it's sort of a new term, and it's composed of both a therapy and a diagnostic test which can predict the response to that treatment. And it's really the foundation of how we treat patients in nuclear medicine using this treatment called lutate, or peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. And the idea is that people can have a scan. If I've just got the mouse working, they can have a scan, and that can look to see if a target is being expressed on the tumour that patients have. And if it is, then instead of using a compound that seeks out the target for imaging, it has a different radionuclide or radioactive substance attached to it, that then, when that's given as a treatment, it can deliver really intense radiation within about 1 millimetre of wherever those tumours are in the body. And then to follow up the same scan, which in this case we're talking about a dotatate PET scan, which is used at our centre, we can then look and see what the response is. And if the disease comes back, it can be retreated with the same treatment. One of the important things is that using this concept of doing a test beforehand, you can see if the target's being expressed, and importantly, if it's not being expressed, then sort of futile therapy is avoided, and you know that you should use a different treatment instead. When we talk about neuroendocrine tumours, as David's already discussed, these arise from a variety of different organs within the body, including predominantly what we focus on is either those tumours in the lungs, the pancreas, and the small bowel. But neuroendocrine tumours can also involve other organs such as the thyroid, adrenal, and the cervix and ovary. When we talk about this kind of imaging that we use, which is somatostatin receptor imaging, that's what it's targeting, is these receptors that are commonly found on neuroendocrine tumours. There has been a change and an evolution in the kind of imaging that we use, from more traditional nuclear medicine scans that have been around for nearly 50 years, through really now to the advent of what's called dotatate PET-CT, which provides much greater imaging resolution in 3 dimensions. And this is actually imaging done of the same patient just 4 days apart. So really you can see that with that advent of new technology, it's really helped with our imaging and characterisation of NETs. When we talk about this dotatate PET scan, there's several indications for it, or reasons why the doctors might do this scan, and that includes staging. So in certain people, that scan might be done before a patient has surgery, just to make sure that the tumour hasn't spread anywhere else. It can also be done sometimes when these tumours can produce hormones that can cause certain symptoms, and these scans can be done to actually localise where it's coming from. We've briefly talked about theranostics, where we can use the scan to predict the response to the therapy, and it can also be used after patients have had surgery to make sure that the tumours haven't come back. There are also different traces that we can use in nuclear medicine that are relevant to neuroendocrine tumours. I won't go through them in great detail today, but it can include F-DOPA, which is a PET scan that's used in patients who've got pheochromocytomas, or tumours of the adrenal gland. It can also be, we can also use MIBG, which is another tracer that looks at pheochromocytomas or paragangliomas. We've briefly talked about the somatostatin receptor analogues, so like dotatate PET. And there's also FDG, which I'll talk about imminently. One of the concepts about these tumours is that if the tumours have spread in the body, they may not all actually behave the same, and some might grow faster than others. And so, using this kind of PET imaging is quite a helpful way of looking at the different, biology or the different behaviour of tumours throughout the body. And this is where the use of FDG, which is it's a sugar PET scan, and basically, tumours that are growing more quickly, they tend to use more sugar. They're sort of more hungry, using and requiring more energy. And so an FDG PET scan is a way of imaging that sugar use. It's basically radioactive sugar that's injected into the patient, and then we can image and see, which tumours in the body, or if the tumour is using more sugar than would be expected. And this was a case that demonstrates the way how it can be used. This is sort of an extreme case. It's a patient who had a neuroendocrine tumour that was producing insulin. And insulin actually makes your blood sugar levels drop. And so not only the tumour growing can cause problems, but also, the hormonal production. And what you could see, this patient had both kinds of PET scans. They had the dotatate PET scan, which is looking at these receptors that we can use to target for therapy. And they also had the sugar PET scan. And you could see, within the same part of the body, within the pancreas, part of it wasn't taking up very much of the dotatate at all. But that part of the tumour was actually using quite a lot of sugar. And so that told us that part of the tumour was actually, a little bit more aggressive and growing more quickly. But then looking in the liver, it was the opposite. It was there were more of those somatostatin receptors, which is more like normal neuroendocrine cells. And we were able to determine from that was actually the site that was making more of the insulin, and that was the site to treat. And it was quite helpful in that it totally removed the symptoms of low blood sugar for this patient. So it's just one way that we can use the different types of imaging, to help treating patients. And so there are a couple of reasons we don't do FDG PET scans in everybody, but there are certain characteristics that are used for the doctors to decide, if they would do an FDG PET scan in addition to a dotatate PET scan. And the combination of those two scans can guide the way that treatment's given. With regard to PRRT, or peptide receptor radionuclide therapy, this is basically a way of changing the radioactive isotope that's attached to the dotatate, and basically it will bind to the receptors, get internalised, and then it delivers really intense radiation within about 1 to 2 millimetres of every cell that it would enter. I'll just skip over this case in the interest of time. But really the evidence to support this, there was a big trial that was done about 2 years ago. It was published in really one of the biggest medical journals in the world, the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed really quite dramatic responses. So these are patients who had predominantly small bowel neuroendocrine tumours that had spread throughout the body, and the patients were either offered to have the standard treatment at that point, which was somatostatin analogues, or they were randomised to have the dotatate. And in those patients where the tumours had been, shown to be progressing, it really showed quite significant results and an improvement in the response. The way that there's several criteria that are used, so it's not given, to every patient, because it does have side effects as well. But for patients who've got tumours that can't be removed from surgery, that have adequate uptake on that dotatate PET scan I've talked about, and they don't have any evidence of disease that's not expressing the target, and they have growth of the tumour within a 12-month period, and uncontrolled symptoms, it's quite a useful treatment in that population. It does have some side effects. It's generally quite well tolerated, but people can have some nausea or discomfort also at the sites of where the tumours are, and people can also feel quite fatigued for a couple of weeks after the treatment. It can also rarely cause just a small degree of hair loss, but it's not commonly a major issue. The thing that we always advise people about is that it rarely can cause like a bone marrow cancer, and that's in about 1 to 2% of people. But when that's weighed up against the actual the benefits of the treatment, and particularly from what we know about the trial, people were far better off with the treatment overall than without that. But it's something to be mindful of, and that's why we don't treat everybody. When people are referred to the Royal Brisbane to have PRRT as a treatment, they're initially referred through the neuroendocrine tumour MDT, where they'd see David Wild or Matt Burge, who are two of the oncologists. We then discuss the cases in a group meeting that also has Amanda Love present, our nursing staff, so Stephen Notcher, who's here tonight also, and the nuclear medicine doctors, and we'll review the scans and we'll discuss the case history, discuss the pathology, and then make a decision whether patients are suitable to have this treatment or not. And following that, if there's a decision that that the group thinks that it's worthwhile to have the treatment or to consider it, they'll then come and see us in nuclear medicine. We do a kidney test just to make sure that the kidney function is adequate, and then we'd have a discussion, review the images together, and discuss things in a bit more detail. And when the treatment's actually administered, it's administered over 4 cycles. And on each of those days, the patient would come to the Royal Brisbane, they'd be admitted for the day, just for a couple of hours, they'd have a drip put in, and then there's an amino acid infusion, which is about 1 litre of fluid, which is run through the drip, and that just helps to protect the kidneys from absorbing too much of the radioactive treatment. And then, the lutate just runs through over about 15 minutes during that time. And then patients come back the following day to have a post-treatment scan to see that, essentially showing that the treatment goes to where we expect it to go on the basis of the PET scan. And then have a brief consultation to ensure people have tolerated the treatment well. And then that's repeated about 8 weeks apart for 4 treatments in total. And then patients would also, during that time, maintain clinical follow-up with their oncologist. Just briefly to touch on a bit more of an update, there are some other promising treatments that are on the horizon. There's always research being done, and so there's even newer compounds of this lutate that are being developed, particularly overseas and currently in clinical trials, that might be able to provide even more radiation to the treatment or to the tumours and less to the actual to the normal tissues. There's also new forms of PET scans that are being developed. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is one that essentially shows greater uptake, greater tumour to background targeting, so that doctors can identify things a bit more accurately. And it's just briefly to also mention that there are several multi-centre Australian neuroendocrine tumour trials. So there's been the Control Nets trial, which is close to recruitment now, and that data is all being analysed, and then that's been sponsored by the Unicorn Foundation. It's played a key role in running of that trial, and then that once that has been analysed and all the results are in, hopefully that will help to inform the treatment of patients with neuroendocrine tumours within Australia and throughout the world. And that's looking at the combination of adding in chemotherapy to the lutate. And there's also a current proposed trial which is still looking for funding and finalising that, but there will be another trial looking at those patients who happen to have the higher grade neuroendocrine tumours, the group that David Wild talked about earlier. And so that's a trial which is in the stage. It's got support from a variety of different societies, but it's just the funding in particular is being finalised. So it's not yet open, but that's a proposal. So I'd just like to finish on that note and say, thank you for listening, and hopefully we don't actually need to see you in nuclear medicine, but if we do, we look forward to helping you. Thank you.